So in the next section, I want to respond to some common arguments for the denial of my conclusion. That is, some common arguments given to think, no, animal experimentation is morally permissible. It's not wrong because blah, blah, blah. And again, I'm responding to objections first because I think people are often kind of defensive about this issue, and it might be good to respond to objections first. So then they would be more open to thinking about, well, maybe there are some good reasons to think that animal experimentation is actually wrong. Here's a lot of things that are said in defense of animal experimentation. Here's a lot of arguments that are given to think that it's morally permissible or not wrong. People say animal experimentation is not wrong because humans benefit from it. There are no alternatives. It's necessary. These are three different ideas, and we'll look at all of them. People often respond, well, animals aren't rational. They're not moral agents. They don't contribute to our culture. They don't have a sense of the future. They're not self-aware. Basically, they point to a lot of traits that they think animals don't have, and they think this justifies animal experimentation. A more abstract type of argument says that, well, animals aren't members of species or kinds or groups that are rational or are moral agents or contributes to culture, are self-aware, and so on. So this is a more abstract argument than the second one. I think the first type of arguments, however, are the most common ones for many people, but they definitely lead to the second and sometimes the third. So here's the argument, and I've added the unstated premise in a different color. So the conclusion is that animal experimentation is morally permissible. Which animal experimentation? Well, I think in practice, most people who give this type of argument are really in favor of most experimentation. They rarely sort of condemn animal experimentations that are actually done. So the conclusion is animal experimentation is morally permissible. Let's assume this means really most of it. Well, why think that? Well, humans benefit from animal experimentation. And if humans benefit from doing something, doing some action X, then that action is morally permissible. Now, when people give this argument, they usually don't offer this second premise. They just say, look, humans benefit, end of story. Animal experimentation is okay. But let's apply some of our skills. Humans benefit from animal experimentation. The first premise. What do you mean? Do you mean all humans benefit from animal experimentation? Some humans benefit from experimentation on animals? All animal experiments benefit humans? Which one? So basically, there's some imprecision here that you really need to think through. This is like a generalization that would need to be analyzed. So the first claim is imprecise in saying that humans benefit. We would need to know a lot of details about what exactly is being said to understand whether this is true or false. It's important to also notice that this first premise ignores any potential harms to humans that result from animal experimentation. And these harms could be direct harms in various ways. The direct harms might be perhaps some animal experimentation is done, it seems promising, and then what's done is on humans, and it doesn't work out well, and humans are harmed from it. So it's often argued that animal research sometimes misleads researchers and leads them to doing things that are harmful for humans. And that would need to be factored in thinking about a claim that humans benefit from it. They might benefit, but they might also harm, or they might also be harmed. So how do those harms get factored into the overall benefit, if any? So there's the potential for direct harms to humans from animal research, but there are always indirect harms to humans from animal research. What does this mean? Well, basically, when you're doing animal research, you're not doing something else. And if that something else would be more beneficial than the animal research, then that's a loss. And that could be seen as a harm. Seems like that should be seen as a harm because people aren't better off because this isn't done because people are doing animal research. So there's a whole science to thinking about whether premise one is true or false, and I'll get to that a little bit down the road. But the point is premise one can be thought about in really kind of rigorous ways, and we could try to get some real data to analyze it. What's most important, though, is that premise two simply ignores any harms to animals. It just says if humans benefit from doing things that harm animals, then what humans are doing is okay. And the serious question is, well, why? Why exactly is it okay to harm animals to benefit humans? We would need a serious answer for that question. And oftentimes it's just not given. So an answer can be developed from some ideas we'll talk about in a moment, and we'll come back to that. All right, next argument. Conclusion. Animal experimentation is morally permissible. Why is that? Animal experimentation is necessary. This is often, people say this sort of all the time. Well, we just need to do animal experimentation, and that's why it's okay. Well, here we have the claim that any action that's necessary is morally permissible. Well, let's think about the arguments. The first premise seems to be kind of unclear. We can see it's unclear by thinking just about the word necessary. If something's necessary, it's always like necessary for what? So animal experimentation is necessary for what? This really needs to be explained. If somebody says it's necessary for medical progress, medical benefits, well, that seems to be just false. Why is that? Well, there's other ways to achieve medical benefits. There's other types of research. There are other things that can be done to produce medical benefits or just profound benefits for human beings. The second premise, however, seems to be false also. So the idea is just because doing something is necessary to achieve some goal, that doesn't make doing that something okay. We can see this by thinking about, go back to the Willowbrook case earlier. Suppose the doctor says, well, to learn what I want to learn, it's just necessary to experiment on these children. Well, it might be true that to learn what he wants to learn, he has to experiment on those children. It's necessary. Does that make doing those experiments on those children okay? No. So I think this is a kind of profound point that's often overlooked, and people simply debate whether animal experimentation is necessary for some goals or not, but they don't think about the more basic idea of, all right, if you have to do something to achieve some goal, does that make doing that something okay? And the answer seems to be no, not at all. All right, finally, it seems like this whole argument is question begging, or just assumes the conclusion that it's trying to argue for. Why is that? Well, you wouldn't give this argument in defense of human experimentation. That wouldn't be a good argument. We would recognize you're just assuming that this type of experimentation is not wrong when it's really wrong. And it seems like the person giving this argument is just assuming that animal experimentation is morally permissible. So that is generally not good. It's never good. You can't assume what you're trying to argue for, and this argument seems to do that. Finally, and there's a theme here, we have the claim that the animal experimentation is okay because there's no alternatives. People say this quite often. There's just no alternatives to animal experimentation. The alternatives aren't good enough. And so until we have great alternatives, animal experimentation is still morally permissible. Well, to complete the reasoning, again, you have to think if there's no alternatives to doing something, then that doing something is okay. But again, this seems to be a not good argument. What do you mean there's no alternatives? Sure, there are alternatives. There's lots of other things that could be done other than animal experimentation. There's all sorts of other research methods. Clinical research, in vitro research, public health research, epidemiology. One alternative is distributing known medical knowledge and treatments more. Education is an alternative. Prevention is an alternative. There's all sorts of other things that could be done, other alternatives, so to speak, to produce medical benefits. One alternative is just not doing animal experimentation. You say there's no alternatives? No, that's false. You could do something else, like not do it. So taken very literally, one is just not true. But more importantly, again, just because there's no alternatives to doing something doesn't make it okay. Somebody might respond, well, to learn the exact thing that I want to learn, I need to do animal research. That might be true, but just because there's no alternatives to doing something does not make it okay. Again, the Willowbrook doctor might have said there is no alternative to using these children to learn what I need to learn. Well, maybe, but that doesn't make it okay. So finally, again, this seems to be a question-begging argument. It just sort of assumes that it's okay to harm all animals when there are no alternatives, so to speak, without really giving much in the way of a reason for it. So these are three common arguments, and there's some themes for how I've objected to them. Let me just sort of point out that there's a science of trying to evaluate the science of animal research, and some popular sources for information on that, which will take you to scholarly resources, are the Americans for Medical Advancement webpage, PCRM, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and go to PubMed or whatever. There's all sorts of scientific research on the science of animal research. So here's a pretty famous article. I looked it up a moment ago. It's got about like 450 citations or people citing it from the British Medical Journal. Where's the evidence that animal research benefits humans? So here's another one. These are dated. There's much more newer things. Comparison of treatment effects between animal experiments and clinical trials. A systematic review. Medical progress depends on animal models, doesn't it? So there's a lot of scientific research on the science of alternatives, and this is worthwhile looking into. So here's a book, The Costs and Benefits by Andrew Knight. He's a veterinarian, and there are a comprehensive review of the recent scientific evidence examining the contributions of animal experimentation to human healthcare. And there's a lot of resources on this topic of the science of animal research, trying to really scientifically examine claims about benefits and harms and so on and so forth. So that needs to be investigated to really understand the issue. All right, so people might respond to the arguments above with something like this. Well, all right, here's what explains the difference in terms of how we can treat animals versus human beings. Here's my response to your arguments above. Here's really why animals are permissible to experiment on. Animals aren't rational, they're not moral agents, they don't contribute to cultures, they don't have a sense of the future, they're not self-aware, things like this. And that's why animal experiments are okay. Now, we know a little bit of logic now, and we can recognize that this argument relies on premise 2 in the middle, which seems to be something like, well, any being that's not rational, is not a moral agent, is not self-aware, and so on, well, they are morally permissible to experiment on. Animals are like that. So premise 2, so therefore the conclusion. Well, the glaringly obvious problem is that premise 2 just seems to be false. There's all sorts of human beings that aren't rational in the sense that the advocate of this argument probably means. They can't think super fancy things. They're not a moral agent. They might not be self-aware. And so there's all sorts of human beings, babies, mentally challenged people that are like this, but they're not permissible to experiment on in harmful sorts of ways. So the second premise just seems to be false. You might also kind of disagree with the first premise. You could ask, well, what do you mean by rational? What does that exactly mean? Because it does seem like animals are rational in some sense. The claim that animals aren't moral agents, this is sort of increasingly controversial. There's arguments that many animals seem to have a sense of morality, a sense of fairness, a sense of wanting to help their peers and help members of other species sometimes. There's the thought that animals have cultures and social relationships. I mean, certainly social relationships, perhaps even cultures sometimes. You could argue that animals do have some sense of the future, and they often are self-aware. Premise 1 might be false too, but I think the real problem here is thinking that if you don't have a super sophisticated, fancy mind like some human beings have, that makes it okay for you to be experimented on. And that just seems to be not true. And the counterexamples from various human beings seem to show that. In response, here's probably the most abstract thing that we get. People sometimes say, like, well, all right, the problem with that argument can be fixed by saying, well, as a species, we're rational. As a species, we're moral agents. Or we're the kind of beings that are moral agents. We're the kind of beings that are self-aware. And therefore, the babies and the mentally challenged people, they would be wrong to experiment on because they're a member of this group or species or kinds. And, animals aren't members of those groups or species or kinds. So that's why animals are okay to harm. And that's why animal experimentation is okay. So this is a fairly kind of abstract reasoning. And I think it's worthwhile to think about whether it really makes sense. Is it true that if you're a member of our species or the group of beings that's usually rational, is it true that you sort of get all the rights that the actually rational beings tend to have? I think some things to think about that would be that, well, what does this sort of view imply for individuals who are permanently in comas? Or we believe they're permanently in a coma, they're probably not going to wake up. Many people tend to think, well, they can be treated differently from, say, anybody watching this video. Well, they're of the same species as us, same kind of group in a certain way, but their individual characteristics seem to matter quite a bit. So it seems like just because you're a member of a group or a species that has certain characteristics that gives various rights, that doesn't mean the individuals always have those rights. You could also take this idea and sort of see, well, what does this imply for like embryo experimentation? What does this imply for abortions? and wonder about that. So I think this move to you're a member of this group or species, so therefore you should be treated a certain way because of what the other members of the group or species are like, I don't think that really works out in the long run. And actually, I have a few articles on this exact topic, called them kind arguments, and there's a famous advocate of kind arguments against animal rights. And long ago, I had an article where I argued that if you kind of think through these things through, you can actually get an argument for animal right from them. Why is that? Well, because us and animals are of some of the same groups. You know, we're all conscious, we're all feeling, we're all sentient. So you can kind of run the same type of reasoning for the opposite sorts of conclusion.